Good evening, members. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Gil. I'm one of the events managers at the Wine Society. And for tonight's event, we're going to be spending the next hour, just over an hour and 15 minutes, discussing some of the key moments in wine's rich and long past. To navigate us on this journey, I'm thrilled to be joined by our very special guest and author of the very book, Vintage Crime, that has inspired tonight's event, Rebecca Gibb MW. So, Rebecca, welcome.
Very much for having me. Delighted to be here.
No, thank you very much. Very excited about tonight's event, and there's a lot for us to talk about. You very kindly suggested a few key talking points that we'll cover very shortly. But before we do, members, just a little bit of housekeeping to begin with. Hopefully, this will be unnecessary, but if you are encountering any technical difficulties tonight, please do contact me, and I'll do my best to resolve the issue. You can contact me one of three ways, either email at tastings@thewinesociety.com, or via Zoom, you can contact me by going onto the reactions button. You'll see a raise hand. If you press that, that'll alert to me. Otherwise, you can drop me a message through the chat function here on Zoom as well. But as I say, hopefully there'll be no need for any of that and everything will go wonderfully smoothly. Also, talking of the chat, please do let us know where you're joining us from, what's in your glass, and do please share your stories, your thoughts, your feelings on all of the topics that we discussed tonight. I'm sure that many of you will have questions for Rebecca, and we encourage lots of questions if you have them. One thing I would say, please do ask your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom tab here. That way it'll keep very much front and center. I'll be able to see the question and therefore much more likely to ask it and get that answer that you're craving. Right, Rebecca, that's, I think, enough of the housekeeping. Thank you again for joining us. I wonder if we could, before we talk about some of these key moments in history, your book, Vintage Crime, I'm very interested to know kind of how it came about and your story of the kind of concept of this book and the research and the paths it took you.
Sure, thank you very much, Gail. So I have written Vintage Crime as it was inspired by wine fraud. And the reason why I was inspired by wine fraud was that in 2012, after having passed the Master of Wine tasting and the theory component, I was looking for a research paper subject. And after two attempts, unsuccessful attempts at getting a subject across the line, it turned out that when I was just doing some bedtime reading of a book called Champagne by
Mhm.
Donny and Petty Cladstrup, who also wrote Wine and War, I imagine some of you have read that book previously, that there was a very brief mention of these riots in Champagne in 1911. And I was like, oh, wine, riots, well, that's something I could get behind. So I started to do a little bit of research based on that. I had a history degree, and so that research had been a wine journalist already at that time for about 10 years. So this was sort of my, I was playing to my strengths, and I started investigating Champagne riots in English and realized there was absolute paucity of information about it at the time.
Mhm.
So I then went and looked into the archives in France. Luckily, I speak well. I did A-level French. It's good enough. It can get me by. And I started looking into the archives and realizing that while there had been a little bit of research done around the narrative of what had actually happened, there wasn't a great deal of research on why this has happened, why the Champagne riots had happened in 1911. And sorry, I'll come closer. Shall I come closer to the microphone? Sorry,
Yeah,
everyone.
thank you.
So while I heard, I'll speak a bit louder as well. That might work. That might kill two birds. So I found this paucity of information. Yes, there was a narrative about the Champagne riots, but it turned out that there wasn't a lot of research behind the whys and why this had happened. In the 1960s, there had been a little bit of research into sort of the more that the trade unionist, was it a socialist revolution, that sort of thing,
Mhm.
and definitely trade unions had been involved, but it turned out that no one had actually looked whether people were rioting because basically people had no money. As a result, I wrote this research paper for Master of Wine, got my Master of Wine in 2015, but I wasn't kind of done with wine fraud at that time. As we'll talk about a little bit more about why the Champagne riots had happened
Mhm.
as we go through this tour, but it turned out that fraud was one of the major reasons for why people were rioting in the streets in Epinay and IE in 1911, burning down champagne houses, that sort of thing. It turned out, but it turned out there was lots more stories to research, and so I started writing a book proposal. Yeah, that was sort of 7 or 8 years ago. Yeah, and now here I am talking to Wine Society members in 2024. So yeah, the process of writing a book has taken some time.
Like you sort of mentioned there, obviously the MW studies and passing, that's no mean feat in any stretch. That's quite an achievement. And then, yeah, as you say, many years researching this book, but thank you very much. It is a fantastic read and reread. There are many times when I go back through lots of the subject matter, lots to sort of pick out, huge amounts of research done. But if we talk, before we talk a bit, you mentioned about the Champagne riots, and we'll cover that moment in history a little bit later. But I suppose at the beginning, why, how easy this is to answer, but why do we drink wine? Is always a question. And where did that begin? I know we'll talk a little bit about the Romans as well in a moment, but why did we start drinking wine, and where did that come from?
So I think that during the process of writing this book, I'd struggled with the thread. I'd found lots of wine frauds, lots of wine incidents of what was occurring. But ultimately, it was like, why am I writing this book? What is the common thread across this book? And ultimately, it came back to, why are we drinking wine, and why are people committing fraud, and ultimately, why do we drink wine? And my takeout from this was, after 10 years, was that really we drink wine. I mean, we drink it because it obviously has an intoxicating purpose, but we drink wine because it tastes nice. We drink wine because it gives us pleasure. We love the pleasure of it, sensory pleasure. We put it in our mouths, we drink it, it pleases us. And ultimately, that's why wine exists. And that's one of the reasons why fraud has existed throughout history, is that for a long time, really until very recently, wine hasn't tasted so good. We know we can ship wine now from New Zealand, put in a glass bottle with a screw cap on, or we can put it in a flexi tank and ship it all the way across, all across the ocean, and it comes to our glass in the way that the winemaker intended. Now, that is a very new phenomenon, and really, ultimately, we derive pleasure from that. But if we wanted to do that, it wouldn't have been possible, even 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. So wine ultimately is about pleasure, and wine fraud has in a lot of the historical instances has occurred because the wine that they produced was, or no longer was, pleasurable to drink, and so that was what I would call a melioration, to make the wine actually taste better and give the drinker ultimately the pleasure that they were seeking.
Yeah. And a lot of that I suppose changing, and maybe we'll get onto this in a moment now, or we can move straight on to drinking wines in Roman times and what was being drunk. But there were lots of ingredients sort of added to wines. As you say, to improve, to make better. But these were kind of well known. It was sort of public knowledge. It wasn't that this was behind closed doors. People knew and deliberately intended this. But so if we start then on the sort of the chronology of our history this evening, what were the Romans drinking wine-wise? Were they all drinking the same wines, or was it different social classes?
No, very much like everyone's drinking tonight, where everyone was drinking very different things. Oh, there's a 2017 Pinot Noir from Felton Road there. Delicious. I also have a glass of Central Otago Pinot Noir in my glass tonight. So I'm not alone there. But yeah, the reason, so back in Roman times, the book spans basically to 2000 years, because I love to give myself a challenge. And in Roman times, we weren't using sulfur to be able to use that as a preservative and antioxidant. As soon as wine had been harvested, picked, the oxidation process was in full swing. So in a bid to prevent wine from turning to vinegar, or well, they didn't really have a great deal to stop that. They would then try to camouflage the taste with various items, from seawater to herbs to spices, and yeah, and so to just basically to make the wine taste better. They didn't have the technology at their disposal that we do now, but it was quite common, as you say, Gil. It was really quite common knowledge that this was occurring, and people would actually, they would have, if the wealthy, if they had in their houses an amphora, for example, there would be herbs just floating in the wine, and actually the Solarius, who was effectively the house sommelier, he
Mhm.
would have to drain the wine off basically using a strainer before serving the wine, so there were no floaters in your wine. Basically, it was common
Yeah.
knowledge that these was being added. People would actually sort of carry their own sort of herbs and spices when they were traveling, and they would actually actively add them to wine in a bid to camouflage the vinegary wine, for example. That said, the very top wines of of the first century AD weren't there to be authenticated. So it was kind of like two levels. There was the fine wine level and there was the everyday level. And
Mhm.
if you had the fine wines, for example, if you were wealthy, if you were a Roman emperor, if you were among that circle, the wealthy circle, you would try to be showing off with your very pure, authentic wines. Now, at that time, wines tended to be sweet, and they would be quite potent. So you might have to water them down, um, so that you didn't become drunk. Because if you got inebriated if you were in wealthy society, it wasn't considered the done thing.
No.
Um, it really wasn't. And then, but then, yes, lots of people would be adding stuff to the wines, from sugar to make it sweeter to, these all these herbs and spices. But as I say, very much at the top level, they wanted purity, and they only wanted the best, and they would pay for the best in very much the same way that you might pay for a first growth Bordeaux or a Grand Cru Burgundy. They would be willing to pay for wines like Falernian, which was just situated about 30 miles north of Naples, or they'd be drinking like Mamertine, which was from Sicily. These would be wines that were considered top of the top, and
Mhm.
these were the ones to have. That said, you could go to a wine bar. There's a wine bar, like there's etchings in Pompeii, for example, where you could buy Falernian, supposedly, and it was about 4 times the price of the house wine. Now, if you went and drank, if you could buy Lafite or DRC for 4 times the price of the house wine, you would be absolutely delighted, I'm sure. So there's a little bit of query over whether that was
Mm.
really a thing. There was a lot more Falernian drunk than there was produced, and very much in the same way that top Bordeaux producers want to smash the bottles after they've been drunk so that they don't get resold and potentially refilled. There was potentially a lot going on in terms of amphoras that had the Falernian and the Mamertine written on them, and they were refilled with some things that weren't actually genuine.
Yeah. You mentioned that the point you make there about how more Fenelon was drunk than was made and produced,
Hmm.
and that's something I think that's happened a few times over the course of wine's history, where you sort of look back through the records, and it would seem that more people were drinking these particular wines than had been produced. So it's a fairly telltale sign that something's awry. Um,
Yeah, certainly. There's lots of examples. At one point, there's an example of there was more pomade or something drunk in America in one day than there is produced in a year. So,
yeah,
this is a story that runs for 2 millennia, and I don't
no,
think it's over yet.
no. Um, so if we fast forward a little bit, because well, quite a bit actually, but you mentioned in the book one of the world's great composers. There's a piece where you talk about Beethoven. Contentious there. I believe everybody would agree one of the world's great composers, and his connection with wine, his sort of love of wine, and it's a fairly sad tale in regards to him.
Well, yeah, we all know how it ends.
Yeah.
I'm actually listening to a podcast on The Rest is History at the moment, and it's
Yeah.
a five-parter on the Titanic, and you know how it's going to end, but it's still fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, Beethoven wasn't obviously, most people know he became deaf during his lifetime, but many people might not know that he had a lot of health problems. He had really bad digestion problems, and particularly potentially had gout. He really suffered, and it is potentially that one of the reasons why he suffered so much was because he might have had lead poisoning, which was caused potentially by his high wine intake.
Mm.
There has been quite a controversy. Like if you'd said that 10 years ago, it was kind of considered that yes, definitely it was lead poisoning that killed Beethoven, and wine was probably the major culprit. But in recent years, there's been a couple of studies that have found all the evidence, basically Beethoven's hair, Beethoven's skull fragments, that have been tested, that have been used to prove this fact, have actually been proven not to be his.
Yes.
Which has somewhat turned the theory on its head. However, the latest research suggests that he did have cirrhosis of the liver, and when he died, and that it's possible that and they're still saying it's probably his high intake of wine that was probably riddled with lead at that time was possible, what remains one of the major factors in his death. So yeah, lead in wine has been going on since Roman times, and the reason why why lead got into wine in the first place is because we are now living in an age of global warming, and grapes ripen almost too much. We're seeing crazy alcohol levels coming out of the Loire Valley, for example. Now it was unheard of, and harvest dates coming forward so much. But back in Roman times, even to very recent times, getting grapes ripe was really some achievement. We had quite a lot of sour grapes throughout history, and once again, the reason why we drink wine is pleasure. No one wants to drink sour wine, do they? So what do you do to help your wine become less sour? Well, sweetness is a great way to hide and counterbalance the sourness of the grape juice that you obtain through the season. And one of the ways that you can create sweetness in the absence of expensive sugar, for example, which wasn't readily available, was by boiling down grape must, by boiling down grape juice in a vessel to make basically a reduction, what we would use for a sauce today. I'm sure you've reduced a gravy, you've reduced a sauce down, and this made it more concentrated, sweeter. But one of the problem here was that they were boiling this grape must down in lead-lined vessels, and the lead-lined vessels were leaching. The lead was leaching into this, what we'd call in Roman times, we called it sapper or defrutum, and this grape must became lead riddled. It then was put into the wine. It made a sour wine much more lovely. Don't get me wrong, but yeah, not great for your health.
No.
No, and this continued. This practice was continuing long into the 18th century. So, but Beethoven had a real penchant for port at that time, and the distillate, the brandy that you add to port to fortify it to make it like a 19 or 20% alcohol wine was distilled in basically lead-lined vessels. So often the brandy was riddled with lead. Then it was poured into the fermenting must to make port. Yeah, not great.
No.
Yeah,
And
and incidences of gout and like lead-related gout in 18th and 19th century Britain are through the roof,
yeah.
particularly like some of the ruling classes who were drinking them in the gentlemen's clubs. It's
Mhm.
absolutely mind-boggling.
You mentioned there that Beethoven enjoyed port, but there was am I right? His last shipment of wine was Riesling. Was it Rheingau Riesling? Was it?
It was a Rangarislin from the village of Rudesheim. Yeah, so
Yeah.
he'd ordered some wine from. He's asked his music publisher, Schott and Sons, who are still around today in the town of Mainz, to arrange a shipment of wine to him in Vienna, and he'd at this point people would already realize that really, if you wanted to assure the provenance of your wine, you needed to get it shipped direct, to avoid any unscrupulous merchants. And yeah, so he'd ask his music publisher to send him these wines, and literally on the day he died, the wine arrived, and his last words were pity, too late, in relation to the wine arriving. But I think there's some sort of irony there, in that the stuff that possibly killed him, uh, you know, was while he was still hungering after.
Yeah.
Basically, he drank wine, he drank beer. He was looking to alcohol for his pain relief, when actually it was possibly the cause of his ailments.
Hmm. Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
that's kind of downbeat.
Well, we'll get on to the very topic that sort of inspired this whole journey there, Champagne riots, in a moment. But just staying on lead there for a moment, it is, I don't know, is the question here a broad question, but is lead still an issue, or is is that still something that's an issue in places?
Certainly hope not, for all
Well,
our
yes.
sakes. Anyway, cheers everybody. Yeah, I certainly hope it isn't. Look, it has been a real issue for a really blooming long time. You'd think so. In Roman times, they kind of recognized that lead was not a great idea for your wine, and then in the 1400s, there was then a papal bull saying don't allow lead to get into your wine. That sort of fell on deaf ears again. Then again in the 1600s, there's more laws come out in southern Germany, saying, no, make sure you don't have any lead in your wine because it's going to kill people. But this keeps on going. It seems to run and run and run, and no one really puts an end to it. And even into the 20th century, we were seeing lead leaching into wines. And in the book that you'll see in the book that actually, it wasn't until the early 1990s that the US FDA actually banned lead capsules. Like, they used to put lead capsules over the
Mhm.
cork. There was a big hoo-ha about it, but actually, if you do have any really old bottles that have got a lead capsule over the cork, literally just give it a wipe. It's not going to leach into your wine cork or your
Yep.
wine. It's been proven, so like that. But yeah, lead decanters. Does anyone have any lead crystal decanters? There's some shocking research was done maybe only 20 years ago, where they poured wine. They took the levels of lead in wine before it went to a lead crystal decanter, and then they took the readings after 2, 3, 4 hours, several days, and the lead levels were at levels that in some instances had gone as high as what they would have expected from the concoctions that, the Plinies and the Columellas and the Catos, like the recipes that they provided in their books. And so yeah, lead still hadn't gone away until then. So yeah, if you had lead crystal decanters, please just leave them on your sideboard and don't put anything in them.
Decoration only.
Decoration only.
Right, if I'm staying chronologically here, let's see if I've got this right there. But let's move on to the Champagne riots, if we may, which, as you said, was 1911.
Indeed, it was. A year
Um,
before
but
Titanic sunk.
but yes, so there's a bit about the riots themselves, but the build-up, I suppose, that sort of the build-up of what caused this and everything that kind of met the head there in April. Was it April 11?
Yeah, Gil, that is a massive question.
I know.
So if we are looking at the champagne rights, why did people in Champagne, when we think about champagne as a luxury product, it's associated with life rites of passage, luxury. If you have ever been, if any of you have ever been to Epinay-Reims, it's a wonderful experience. You can walk down the Avenue du Champagne, you go to the champagne houses through its cellars. It's all very chic. Not so much in the early 1900s. So maybe that there's a big division in Champagne. There's the people who grow the grapes, and there's the people who make the wine. So the champagne houses and the co-ops, and then there's the people who make the wine. And that existed. That's always been as it was. Now phylloxera, that old pesky aphid,
Yes.
turned up in France in the early 1860s, and it's wreaked its havoc through the Languedoc, for example. In the 1860s, they replant, all good, but it doesn't make it to Champagne until 1892. Not only which is quite late, it doesn't make its appearance till then. So in the 1890s and early 1900s, phylloxera is really getting to grips with getting its claws into the champagne vineyard. Grape growers are having to rip their vines out. They're either having to treat them in a bid to try and save them, or they're having to rip them out and replant, which comes with quite a lot of debt associated with it. Now they're doing this because at this time champagne sales they're really soaring. Export markets going great guns. Even the domestic market was really strong. Champagne sales have never been better. At the same time, grape prices are falling. Now, why is this? This is not like, if you see John Maynard Keynes, he says that whole supply demand economics. If demand is going up for champagne and there is a finite area of grapes, surely your grape prices should be following. So why are they not following? They are not following because the champagne houses and some speculative new entrants into the champagne world have been basically buying white wine from cheaper sources, from say the Loire or the Languedoc. They're bringing them over in the trains, trucking them up. They're going into the champagne cellars. They are being made sparkling, and they're coming out with a champagne label on them. So to keep up with the demand and the soaring demand for champagne, they're making champagne out of grapes that are not from Champagne. And it has been speculated that between 1907 and 1911, an economic historian has said that as much as 1 in 2 bottles that were leaving champagne cellars were not grown in Champagne.
Yeah.
This causes grape prices to be depressed at exactly the time that grape growers need to be obtaining the right or more for their grapes, because basically they've replanted after phylloxera or they're on the verge of it. Why does it happen in 1911? Why does it not happen in 1907, etc.? Why not early? Why do they wait till 1911? They wait till 1911 because they have basically a series of failed harvests between 1907 and 1910. In 1910, it basically rains most of the summer, disease is rife, and they harvest just 0.2% of the average crop. 0.2%.
Wow.
So basically, there are no grapes. At the same time, because you have had a bad summer, a lot of the other crops, not just grape crops, a lot of other crops have failed, and you're seeing, including wheat, the Frenchman cannot buy his bread. Wheat prices soar. As a result, bread prices soar. The Champenois grape growers have no money to buy anything because their crops have failed. They're repaying the debts from phylloxera, and they're not getting the great prices that they deserve because the champagne houses or the dodgy champagne houses are just not buying their grapes, yet the champagne houses are really they've got great lucrative business. So it comes to a head in early 1911, and they've had enough,
Yeah.
and they take to the streets.
The perfect storm.
It
What sort
was the perfect storm, and this is all sort of in a this is all sort of in the sort of in the what's fermenting at this time is lots of trade unionism, there's lots of worker rights, there's lots of other strikes going on at this time, like the postal workers, the railway workers. So definitely it's part of a bigger picture. But
Mhm.
yeah, the harvest that harvest in 1910 really brought the camels back. And what what people were campaigning, what growers were campaigning for, was they wanted a boundary around champagne, and they wanted to say you can only make champagne if you are within this boundary. And to be honest, that argument is still rumbling on today, because the
Yep.
INAO, the International Organization for Vine and Wine, they who organize all the appellations in France, they are still, it's taken about 10 years. They're looking at redrawing the boundaries of Champagne now, which is causing all sorts of consternation as it is. But yeah, this is a story that
Mm.
keeps on giving.
So I was going to ask there what sort of came. So you had growers, taken to the streets rioting there. They were joined by other, as you mentioned, joined by other merchants of other trades. So bakers, butchers, others within the villages. It was a kind of a coming together of a few. But
Absolutely. If you're in the village of, say, Haute-Villers, which is where you can go and see like the Dom Perignon tomb and all
Mhm.
that, Haute-Villers, which is a really rural village, or if you're in Ailly, the whole village relies on the prosperity of its grape growers, because they make up the majority of the population. So if you are the boulanger, or if you're the butcher, or if you are the farrier, you are relying on the success of the grape harvests for your living too. So they all come out into the streets. Um, they go out, they burn down champagne houses that they believe um, are responsible for these wrongdoings. They burn vines. They smash a lot of champagne bottles. Like, there are descriptions of wine flowing down the streets like a river.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's the French government actually stationed the French army in
Yeah.
the area at that time to ensure that the peace is kept.
And then you mentioned how the kind of aftermath of that, or they were looking to have a kind of protected area of Champagne. What were the successes of that, or sort of what did come out in those immediate moments in 11 and 12 and that decade?
Yeah, well, there's quite a couple of, as if you know Champagne, there are quite a few areas within
Mm.
Champagne sub-regions, and the historic part is near Troyes, sort of the Aube area, which is where Drapier is based, for example.
Yep.
Now, the people who are up in the Marne, so it's like the key areas around Epinay and Reims, so
Mm.
the and around the Côte de Blanc as well, all that sort of that hub in the northern part of Champagne. They wanted, then the Marne department, they wanted just to be Champagne. They didn't want the guys in the Aube to be part of the department, to be part of the appellation. So also caused a lot of arguments. Then the Aube started protesting that they
Yeah.
weren't in the Champagne region because the Marne didn't want them, and yeah, it goes on and on. But basically, yeah, the Aube was included in the Champagne region, but as like a deuxième zone, which means a second
Mhm.
zone, almost like a second class citizen, even though it was the
Yeah.
historic centre. Um, but then this all happens. So the government starts to get its act together in 1912, and there's lots on the statute books to make it sort of to actually resolve this issue. But then we all know what happens in 1914, and suddenly, appellations are kind of not front of mind
Yeah.
from 1914 onwards, and it takes another sort of 15 years before it starts to come back to the priority again.
Yeah. Yeah. That's understandable. I think that period of 1914 on, there were other things to occupy your mind. Um,
Yeah. 80% of the buildings in France were destroyed.
yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yes. Well, you mentioned there in terms of sort of fast forwarding then 15 or so years before that kind of appellation conversation started to really take heat again. We can, staying in France, we can move to that period, and we're looking at another area of France, a bit further south, in the Rhone Valley and Châteauneuf-du-Pape in particular, is the next kind of discussion point and discussion topic throughout
Is anyone?
history. But
Yeah, I'm just looking. Is anyone having a
yes,
Chateauneuf-du-Pape tonight?
I don't think I saw. Let us know if you are. We've got Grand Cru sparkling water here, which sounds very good indeed. Um,
Well, they won't. Well, you won't have a headache tomorrow. I'm
but
delighted to
no.
see someone's drinking a muscadet though, because I'm a Loire specialist, and I champion muscadet.
Yeah, so there is a Cote de Rhone being enjoyed actually,
All right,
sort of
fabulous.
closest to there. But yeah, so Châteauneuf-du-Pape in the, are we 1930s now?
Yes, well, so we're heading into sort of 1920s, 1930s. So
Yep.
the start of the appellation system was 1936,
Mhm.
officially.
Yep.
But yes, Chateauneuf-du-Pape is considered the first. While Champagne got its boundaries drawn in sort of 1911, 1912, sort of as a concession to calm them all down. Um, yeah, so Chateauneuf-du-Pape is kind of considered the first appellation, what it's deemed to be, or they've done a good marketing job, one of the two. But Chateauneuf-du-Pape was a very famous wine already in the early 1920s, 1930s. It was even famous like sort of in the 1300s when the papacy moved from Rome to Avignon for a brief period. Well, brief period in most of the 14th century. And and so the papacy had moved there, and in that time the wines of the area were discovered, uh, to escape sort of the kerfuffle and like the busy days of being in Avignon. The papacy at one point was moved to Chateauneuf-du-Pape, and around there grew lots of vines were suddenly flourished. So it became a favorite of Pope. In Nostradamus talks about the wines of Chateauneuf-du-Pape being drunk in Rome later, a few centuries later. In the 19th century, it was very rare for wines from the Rhone to be shipped and exported. And there were quite a lot of records showing that Chateauneuf-du-Pape was being exported to the US, to London, in the mid 19th century. This is really early. It has a really great reputation, but in the 20s and 30s, it is much like what happened in Champagne. There are lots of, like, if you say imitation is the greatest form of flattery, right? But they're not so keen on that. So
No.
lots of people were making imitation Chateauneuf-du-Papes, inferior styles, using the name that had been developed over 7 centuries, basically to get more for their wine at that time. So the people of Chateauneuf-du-Pape weren't very happy about this, as you can imagine. So they just happened to have a war hero and qualified lawyer move into the village, who married one of the locals. And they asked him, his name was Baron Leroy, and he came along to their help, and they demanded that you could only make Chateauneuf-du-Pape in a certain area, and it had to have certain rules which were very stringent at that time. And they took it to the courts in I think it was 1929. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was 1929. You can check the book. In
Yep.
19 so in 1929, the Court of Orange, which is like a nearby town, Chateauneuf-du-Pape, they allowed that to happen. So if you were in Chateauneuf-du-Pape, you wanted to put Chateauneuf-du-Pape on your label, you had to pay a levy to be able to use the name. You had to have a minimum alcohol level, which was 12.5%, which seems laughable now. Like, because when you see like the Chateauneuf-du-Pape's coming out with like 17%, you're like,
Mm.
grapes. But yeah, in that time, in that point, getting grapes ripe to that level was considered, quite the feat. And people had to be, you had to have one of those 13 grape varieties permitted. Please don't ask me to name them all, because I will fail miserably. Yes, so 1929, Chateauneuf-du-Pape kind of creates its sort of early incarnation of
Mm.
the appellation, which is then put into place more widely in 1936. Fraud again, though.
Yeah, always there.
Yeah, fraud. I was just trying to beat the fraudsters.
there's just speaking of Bangla, you mentioned there's a story. I think am I remembering this right? His statue went missing, temporarily missing, alongside one or two other statues of other very influential people in the area. And was it that there was a rumor started, or people suspected this might be theft, to create a little mini museum, which I thought was a fairly in a weird way, quite a nice idea to sort of create a museum by
Yeah,
commandeering
well,
these
there's all
statues.
sorts of fun stories, but yes, he went missing. He was stolen. His bust was stolen from a local village. But yeah, he was repatriated, but with quite a big festival. Like you can
Hmm.
read about that in my book. But yeah, there was quite the festival to take him home back to where he belonged.
Yeah, lovely. Good. He wasn't. Was he a winemaker as well? Or
He came from a white well, originally he came from sort of a military family, but his
yeah.
family had moved to the Vendargue, which is in down at the Languedoc. They had
Mhm.
moved there in the early 1900s, and his mum and his parents had become grape growers, and I think that's where he starts to take on. He goes to law school, but he also takes part in more riots in 1907
Yeah.
in Montpellier, which are once again against fraudsters. um, 500,000 people march on Montpellier, and he gets involved. He starts trying to set fire to like government buildings.
Mm.
In a bid, he realizes the plight. He realizes early on the plight of the grape grower
Yeah.
in that period, and the poverty that is being caused by adulteration at that time. And yeah, he champions that, and he becomes. I think he for me would be one of the most influential figures in the French wine industry in the 20th century. Big call, but I'm gonna make it. Heard it here first.
Um, when we were talking about the champagne, you mentioned how there were different, I suppose, different areas and different growers from different sub-regions of Champagne who weren't perhaps seeing, they weren't standing in solidarity, they weren't standing together. But were those in Châteauneuf du Pape, was that appellation all sort of united? Was that a one voice?
No. No, not at all. So there was the producers who just wanted to carry on as they had done forever. Um, they saw, but the problem is when you draw a boundary, someone's always going to be outside the
Yeah.
boundary. And the people who want to create the boundaries, they really want to protect. It's protectionism, and appellation is basically protectionism. They want to protect the reputation of the place that they're from, the place that they're in, and they don't want the inferior land. So whether it's the sandy soils near the river, they don't want those people they don't want those vineyards in their circle, because it may reduce the standing of the boundaries that the area that they want to be in.
Mm.
Also, you have to pay a levy to be able to use the name of the village. And if you live in the village and you've lived in that village and you're a seventh
Yeah.
generation grower in that village, and suddenly someone's telling you that you need to pay to use the name of the village that you've lived in and your family have lived in for X number of years, it doesn't sit well with everybody.
No, I can see that. Yes, absolutely. Right. Um, I think we're going to stay with Europe. There's one particular period of history, I suppose, one particular moment in wine history that's relatively recent, certainly more recent than Roman times, and the 1860s. But if we fast forward now to what are we, 50 years later, mid 80s, there was a particular moment in wine history within Europe, but outside of France, in Austria, that I think we'll sort of talk a little bit about. The members I'm sure you're aware of, but here's a sort of clearing of the air and exactly what happened over those moments in the 80s.
Yes, I see that no one's drinking any Austrian wine today. Shout up if you are. But yes, so 1985,
Mm.
Austrian antifreeze scandal. I'm sure many of you will remember this or have heard of it. So yeah, it's summer 1985, and yeah, it turns out that quite a few wines are being, well, So yeah, quite a few wines are being doctored with a thing called diethylene glycol, which makes a wine taste sweeter. Now, a lot of the reasons that we've been talking about, why do people commit wine adulteration, or why do people ameliorate wine? Once again, it's that whole why do we drink wine? It's for pleasure. So a little earlier, they'd banned in Germany and Austria, they'd banned glycerin, which had previously used to make their wines taste sweeter, to give them more body, to make them just give like smooth all the harsh edges, be banned. So some creative wine producers had started to look for alternatives. And it just so happened that a producer decided to in their tax return, they what's the word for it, in their tax return they put down that they had used,
Yep.
that they put the receipts through for the diethylene glycol. Yeah, it's always and it was the accountant, one of the accountants that had that sort of rang the bell and said, "Oh, what's this for?" So
Mm.
that's what. So that had, but it had come to some people's attention that this was happening, and a few sort of anonymous people had gone to the Austrian wine board and dropped a couple of bottles off. Anyway, it comes to light that people have been adding this diethylene glycol, and it's summer season. It's summer season, so silly season with the media, and somebody picks it up and says it's antifreeze, when actually diethylene glycol is not antifreeze. Actually, ethylene glycol is antifreeze. And ethylene glycol is much more toxic. It can be converted to an acid, which then can, cause liver failure, that sort of thing, and death. But yeah, diethylene glycol is, I mean, I'm not saying diethylene glycol
Mm.
is something that you want to ingest, but it isn't antifreeze. But
No.
the media picked it up and ran with that. But yeah, so then it takes a while, because it takes a while to filter through. Like, the Austrian government had known for at least 6 months before it broke that this was happening, but they hadn't created a test. They didn't know how to create a test for this. There was no way of testing for it. So they had to create, like, and scientists in the labs had to create a way to test for this. And when it breaks, all these horror stories come out in the media, the sensational stories come out in the media, and it causes a huge scare. And wine is being pulled from the shelves faster than it can be drunk, that's for sure. And yeah, and then all these horror stories come out about people being ill, and how toxic it could be. And a lot of it is, there's a lot of misinformation about this. Despite the misinformation, the Austrian wine industry basically collapses overnight. It takes 40 years for the Austrian wine industry sales to get back to pre-1985 levels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course.
I mean, the Austrian wine industry likes to now spin it that, what as a being, they don't like it to call the wine scandal, but they kind of call it like a reset, like the wine scandal. But yeah, it's a massive reset for the wine industry, because basically previous to that, the Austrian wine industry had just planted a lot of grapes in a lot of wrong places. They just planted it on flat lands. It was basically poor viticulture. They were making cheap and cheerful wines that were
Mm.
not quality oriented. And after the wine scandal, a lot of people fall out the industry. Even the good people, a lot of good people even fall out the industry, sadly. Like Lens Moser,
Mm.
the family business was sold. They just, people didn't want to drink Austrian wines anymore. And so yeah, the whole wine industry has to be reset, and they have to rebuild. And the only way that they can rebuild is by focusing on fine wines. And I reckon that you're drunk an Austrian wine at some point today, and they're seen as very pure. They've got some of the strict that between them and the Germans, they always have a little tussle of who's got the more strict wine law. But yes, so they have some of the strictest wine laws today, and I think you can go to a Michelin star restaurant, and if there aren't Austrian wines on the list, you wonder why.
Yeah. I was going to say that's one of those sort of, I suppose, a positive consequence of of what happened is that the toughening up of the laws and the stricter rules and regulations there, and as you say, that focus on fine wine and quality, because they very much is what I certainly have in the glass whenever I have an Austrian wine these days, be it red or white. The quality there is outstanding.
For sure. And I mean, I think at that point as well, lots of in the 1980s, there was a big focus on sweetness.
Hmm.
Very much like it was in Germany, big focus on sweetness and like cheap sweet wine. That was what people, that's what they wanted to, that was the bulk of the sales to the supermarkets, for example, the Germany's big bulk discounters. And that was where most of their sales were occurring in Germany. So they went over the border, sold, it's like pilot high, sell it cheap, and that was ultimately unsustainable. And so yeah, that's why the Austrian wine industry does not bear any resemblance to the wine industry that we see. Yeah, complete change, complete revolution for them.
Yeah, and you mentioned prior to the 80s, those sort of 50s, 60s, I think it was, or 60s, 70s, possibly the decades before. Lots of a huge increase in planting. There was demand for wine in Austria, and so the vines were planted in all sorts of different varietals and different regions. But lots of those have now, I suppose, been uprooted.
Yeah, there was the government. Yeah, gone.
Yeah.
Gone. So yeah, in the 90 in the 19 in the sort of the 1970s, there was 60s and 70s was a lot of planting. There was this prediction that there was going to be a huge boom in
Hmm.
wine sales that never materialized, and so there was all this excess supply that didn't know what to do with it. Yeah, it was all it was all a bit of a disaster, to be honest. Yes. So they created all this wine, and there was no one who wanted it. So yeah, the vineyard area is much smaller than it was
Yeah.
40, 50 years ago.
Members, do please let us know if you have any questions that we've not covered, any particular areas of wine history. Now's the chance to pop your question in the chat. What I liked is reading through the book. There were lots of little sort of stories within stories, I suppose, little areas that the kind of creation or the birth of the restaurant scene as well, sort of moving slightly away from wine for a moment. But I very much enjoyed reading that the birth of the restaurant and the restaurant critic, the food and the wine writers and things like that
Mm.
was a fascinating book. But that must have been, yeah.
Yeah, no, I sometimes go off on tangents. Some people call them vignettes. Which, like, yes, I like to call them vignettes, but yeah, I do. There were occasions when I did go off on a tangent. Sometimes I went down rabbit holes,
Yeah.
and I couldn't get back out of them. But there were so many interesting stories that that I just wanted to explore. And yeah, I think what was really interesting for me in terms of looking at highlighting highlighting wine fraud was the fact that we now know what is good. We've got magazines to read, you get your newsletters, your emails. We've got a wealth of information at our hands to be able to know what's good and what we might like to drink. We've got a guide to give it, we've got guidance. At the start of the 1800s, there was none of this guidance of what was good to drink, what would give us pleasure. And that is people didn't have a discerning palate, so people didn't know whether wine fraud was being committed or not because they didn't know what was wine was meant to taste like.
Mhm.
It isn't until like the birth of the restaurant in the late after the French Revolution, well, just around the time of the French Revolution, just before and just after, and well, the explosion of the French restaurant started in the like the first 2 decades of the 1800s, that you start getting like wine food criticism, like the early J. Rainers, and then you start getting the very birth of wine intellectuals, like
Mhm.
wine criticism, well, not wine criticism, but wine writing,
Yeah.
intellectual wine writing that tells you what's good, like tells you that these are the fourth these are the fourth these are the four first growths at that time, four first growths from Bordeaux. This is what's good, this is what's not good. Don't buy wines from here. This is where you should be buying wines from. so it isn't until these food critics come along, and then these wine critics come, these wine writers come along, it intellectualizes the wine, and it also makes people realize and try and understand what's good, trying to, but at no point at this, like, even you don't even like I mean, this is very early days for like wine connoisseurship to come along. It isn't really until the 20th century that wine connoisseurship really takes off. But yeah, but by knowing what is good, and by knowing what is good, and knowing what wines are meant to taste like, then only then can you know when it isn't right.
Yeah.
So yeah, so fraud has gone on for a really long time, and it's gone undetected because no one knew. And it isn't until sort of the, even with food, like food was being heavily heavily adulterated, particularly in the 1820s in Britain. There's a really great book called Swindled, by oh, what's it? It's, well, yeah. Anyway, there's a really good book called Swindled, that's about food fraud that's going on in the early 19th century. It's, yeah, so all sorts of incredible stuff's being added to children's school lunches. It blows your mind. It's not just turkey twizzlers.
No. We've had a question coming here from one of our members, Peter. Thank you very much, Peter. On even without fraud, growers can damage their market in pursuit of short-term profits, and sort of given examples of potential cases in that respect. In these cases, are there local growers who complain about those particular styles of wines and that kind of short-term?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, just go to any wine region. They're always having wine producers are always having a moan about something. If it's not the weather, it's the other producers. Very much so. I mean, you see, but well, Beaujolais has Nouveau has ruined Beaujolais for a really long time. Much like, yeah, Blue Nun. I mean, everyone associates Blue Nun, Libra Melch, like,
Mhm.
except all of those wines now they associate it with German Riesling, when in fact most of it was Müller-Thurgau. And that's done it no good. But yeah, absolutely. When you go to these regions, yeah, they definitely complain that this is other growers have ruined it for them. But often those, I don't know, I often feel that those come the ones they don't really care about the terroir, or the other people. It's all about their own commercial gain. And that's sort of one of the reasons why fraud happens as well. It's because it's about, people do it because they're out there to make money, and everyone else can go, jump. It doesn't matter to them. I mean, Blue Nun was a huge brand.
Yeah.
He made huge money for everybody else. Much like, the guys, who was it? It's slipped my mind now. In Germany, big company, who commit fraud and now do all those wine tastings like Tupperware parties.
Oh.
I've forgotten who's. It's in my blooming book. It's in my book. You can read it. Ah, dear me. Of course, I know this is the problem with writing a book. So I've been writing it for like 7 or 8 years, and I'm like, oh, I wrote this about 3 years ago, so I forgot to know. Yeah. So basically, yeah, absolutely. You've got to, within every appellation, there's huge quality disparities,
Mhm.
and you can't rely on you can't rely on everyone to be making awesome quality, can you? And
No.
that's a problem of an appellation. You can have inferior terroirs, and you can have superior terroirs, and they're all in the appellation now. And the thing is with appellations is that you pay a levy, and this is something that really struggle with, is that the people who make the most volume, so the big players, they're paying most into that pot, so they tend to have bigger say. So with me, for a wine journalist, if I no longer take wine association trips, like wine grower trips. So, because if I'm going to a region, I need to go and visit, and I need to go and visit certain producers, I'll just go on my own. I'll pay my own way and go independently. Whereas previously, I might have been, if like Chateauneuf de Pape, or if say I was invited by any. See, for example, Moulin Avon in Beaujolais is having its 100th year anniversary this year, and I was invited to go on a 4-day trip. But basically, when you go there, basically you're almost kidnapped in a way. But and you have to go and do a lot of visits to not very good producers, because they are paying the biggest levy because they have the largest production in the appellation. And so you end up going to lots of cooperatives and big companies that don't make very good wine. And ultimately that's sometimes not representative of the place, and it's not really what people want to hear about. But you have to go because of financial interests.
Okay.
That's a bit off topic, sorry.
No, not at all. So in terms of other moments in history, or other than stories there, just looking at the time, they're 8 o'clock, we've got a few more moments. Is there any other area we've not covered, any burning story that you've sort of encountered or discovered in the research and the making of the book and the running of the book?
I think what I mean, now the book's done, I think that when people say, do you think, I think one of the people a lot of questions people ask me, should I be worried about bottles that the bottles that are in my cellar, should I be worried? And I say to you, I would say I wouldn't be worried. If you bought from the Wine Society, yeah, you should definitely be worried. Fraud is rife. But yeah, they don't check or anything. No, don't buy direct from the producers either. But but no, I would say that look, there's lots of concern, particularly in the auction market, about fraud. And the wine industry is definitely saying all the right things. Are they doing the right things? They seem to be. The wine industry has sat on its laurels for too long, and not done anything to try and tackle fraud effectively. And I think that has changed since Rudy Kurniawan went to prison in 2013-14, for committing one quite a large scale for commit. But I think where a lot of the fraud happens now is where, particularly with collector fraud. So like if you're buying first growth Bordeaux, I'll be definitely checking the provenance of that. I'd be checking its, like when you buy a new car, you check its service history, you check its how many owners it's had, you check all of that before you purchase a car. You should be doing that if you're buying fine wine and spending a lot of money. But how the reasons for why we've committed fraud, committed wine adulteration throughout history have basically been made to make wine taste better than it did, because wine, until very recently, wine, you haven't been able to ship wine from all over the world and to arrive in such great condition.
Yep.
All those reasons have now gone. So because we're able to ship wine across the world and wine arrives just as it's meant to be. Collector fraud has become a big issue for sure. And as I say, we're trying to do stuff. Whether the wine industry, the wine auction houses are paying lip services or not is a different service, is a different thing. But yeah, I think AI is coming to our help. And I also think that, but the problem is, always read the small print if you're buying a bottle of wine, because ultimately, if you are buying a very fine bottle of wine, or even if you're buying a 20 quid bottle of wine, which is fine, the onus of proving whether that bottle of wine is authentic or not is actually on the buyer. So it's always a case of buyer beware. So if you are going to spend some decent money, I would always check. But also don't be too, I wouldn't be too worried. Ultimately, I think wine fraud still remains the exception rather than the rule, particularly if you buy from a reputable merchant.
Such as ourselves. Brilliant. Members, if you have any other questions, do.
I've seen another one from Alistair. So big retailers with their own brands are even more suspect than I feared. I don't really understand, but yes. With their own brands, I don't think so. Like big retailers, if it's I don't know, big retailers like Aldi. I mean, well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what their quality control is. I would hope that they're buying like grapes from the right place and putting the right thing in. But every day I've got a Google alert on for wine fraud. So I get an email every day. And there is a lot of fraud, but often the fraud is actually just mislabeling. So it's a Primitivo and it's from Puglia, but it's got some wine in from Calabria. you know,
Hmm.
and it's in the eyes of the law, it's not
Yeah,
legal, but you know, ultimately, is it going to make a massive deal to the glass of wine that you drink? Might hurt the producers and it might hurt the region. It's not really hurting you. Like if a wine has been mislabeled as a Crianza rather than a Joven, yeah, you might like still I can see why you might be aggrieved. But once again, there's a big question here. Like if you don't know you're the victim of a fraud, are you victimized? It's a big question. It's a big philosophical question. It's
it
basically,
is.
you know, if your wine which said it was it was like a an unoaked Rioja, if it was if 40% of it had come from Navarra and you find out about it later after you'd drunk it, would you be really annoyed? And you probably not. I mean, it is. I mean, it's against wine law, and it is misleading, and it shouldn't be done because it's against the law. But, but yeah, it all depends on your opinion on who's losing out, who is the victim, and ultimately why you're drinking that wine and did you enjoy it?
Brilliant. I like that we sort of finish on the philosophical element of wine there. Um,
Right.
well, as I said right from the beginning, thank you very much for joining us this evening, for giving up an hour just over of your Wednesday evening. It's just started to rain here with me as well, but that's a delightful sort of spring. It was nice earlier, and now it's raining. Members, thank you very, very much for joining. I hope you've enjoyed the evening as much as I have. And yes, if this inspired you, if you haven't already, go out and buy your book there, Rebecca. I don't know if you've got the copy in front of you, you can show, but Vintage Crime.
Here it
There
is.
it is. If you haven't got it already, I thoroughly recommend it. It's a fantastic read, and it certainly could have led me down various rabbit holes and further sort of research and reading of my own as well, which is always something I quite enjoy. I'll mention as well that if you do purchase Vintage Crime, 10%, am I right there, Rebecca? 10% of the proceeds go to muscular dystrophy charity. Am I
Yeah,
right?
yeah, 10% of the proceeds, my royalties go to a charity called Duchenne UK, which is a charity for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is a muscle wasting condition that affects young boys, yeah, including my son, who was diagnosed with that 18 months ago. So yeah, there isn't a cure. So yeah, just trying to do when I was finishing the book, we were diagnosed with it. So yeah, if you do buy a book, you will be yeah, it will be a force for good as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again, Rebecca. Thank you, members, and look forward to seeing you again at another event very soon. Have a good evening. Bye bye.